I believe that, we are in a time now where, we have to be able to talk to one another, and we have to be able to disagree, like you and I said. Like, we're both very different in our perspectives on things and how we look at things, but we can still talk about it. We can still be friends, and most importantly, like, we can still work together. We can come together and have some solutions.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari, and today's guest is someone whose career reflects a lifetime of dedication to education, leadership, and innovation. Dr. Karen Beer brings nearly 40 years of experience spanning classroom teaching, district leadership, and Edtech. Karen's career began as a classroom teacher, later serving as a reading specialist, elementary school principal, and supervisor of curriculum and professional development. She spent 8 years as the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment in the Boyertown Area School District in Pennsylvania, where she championed initiatives to enhance teaching and learning. Over the past decade, Karen took her experience to a national stage as Senior Vice President of Discovery Education, where she led professional learning and oversaw statewide and strategic partnerships. Today, Karen continues her work in literacy and leadership as the board chairperson of a non-for-profit in Philadelphia focused on early literacy achievement, and as a school board director in the Palisades School District. Her career is a testament to the power of lifelong learning and a deep commitment to making a difference in the lives of students and educators. But Karen's story starts in a small rural Pennsylvania town where she grew up in a working-class family and became the first in her family to attend college. Inspired by an influential high school English teacher and her father's love of writing poetry, Karen developed a passion for communication and literacy that would shape her career. So I wanted to have Karen on the podcast for a number of reasons, including that she's the only person I know who served in a senior leadership role at a school district and as an executive at an Edtech company, while also being elected to a school board of education. Karen and I really got to know each other during our time at Discovery Education, where we led a lot of the PD work that we co-created with districts in Ontario and British Columbia. We often found ourselves talking about politics and religion. Another reason I wanted to have her on, because we do touch on these topics in this conversation, and despite having different perspectives on many issues, we always approach such conversations with respect and genuine curiosity. I think anyone looking to model how we can productively talk about politics, disagree respectfully, and find common ground might find some value in our approach here. In this episode, we also discuss the evolving role of technology in classrooms, the enduring importance of literacy, and the challenges of professional learning. Karen shares insights from her experiences as a school board member, navigating the complexities of community engagement, and her hopeful vision for the future of education. Dr. Karen Beer's story is one of resilience, innovation, and a steadfast belief in the transformative power of education. And now, for my always timely and relevant conversation with Dr. Karen Beer. Well, Dr. Karen Beer, thank you for joining the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am in the great state of Pennsylvania.
Excellent. And now, Karen, I would have given you a proper introduction at this point, but maybe you can just start us off by giving us a brief overview of what you're up to now.
Sure. So next year will be year 40 in education for me, and I can honestly and truly say that I have loved every role that I've had. I spent 30 years in public education, and then for the last decade, I've been with Discovery Education. And then this past February, after I had spent some really good time with a new grandson, I thought I want to spend some more time with that new grandson, and decided to retire from Discovery Education. So retired in February, and then in March, I started contracting with Discovery, as well as just doing a bunch of different projects, working with organizations here around Pennsylvania, as well as some others nationally. And then also, I ran, as I said in my bio, I ran for school board in November, and school board takes a lot of time. There's a lot that goes with it, and so I'm spending my time with school board, and then I also am the president of a nonprofit organization focused on literacy. So I got lots going on still around education, still loving it.
Well, that is the exact reason why I'm so eager to interview you, because of this varied background. But I'll start by congratulating you on what I'll call a half retirement, because you're still doing. You
sound like my family now, Jason.
Well, I'm sure your community is thankful for the work that you're still doing, and I do want to come to all of the great work and all the experience, because really, with the first several guests that I've had, I want to be able to present the audience with someone with your perspective that is so varied. But one of my kind of guilty pleasures of this podcast is getting to know more about folks that I've known really well for a long time, because I think it's also important to tell the human side to the education story. So can you give me a background, give the audience a background in terms of like where you grew up and how you grew up and what life was like when you were young?
Sure. Well, it's interesting, in my in my decade that I had spent at Discovery, I traveled around and worked with a lot of different districts across the country, and ran into and met a lot of people. And one of the things that I've learned is I think I'm the only person who was born and raised in Pennsylvania and has actually stayed here. And so born and raised here in Pennsylvania, in a very small rural town where my parents were not college graduates. We lived in a very small ranch house, one bathroom. We got our water out of a cistern that was filled by the local fire company, like once a month. And so very, very much country type of atmosphere. And, the district that I went to school in also at the time was very country. And so I didn't have a lot of diverse experiences kind of growing up. But then, when I went to college, of course, in Pennsylvania, and they had a special program there under their education umbrella, just called Upgrading Urban Education. And unbeknownst to me at that time, they chose people for that program who had like no experience with diversity or with inner city or anything like that. And, it was just fabulous for me. And it helped, broaden my horizons, so to speak, because, you grow up in that country atmosphere. It was a very much of a Pennsylvania Dutch community. And, as Pennsylvania Dutch, we tend to think one way. And, and I learned a lot as I went through that program, and have continued to learn a lot, but also learned a lot about my background growing up, and, how it was wonderful, but it was also pretty, this is the way it is, and this is the way you do things.
So sounds like probably a fairly common story for a lot of folks in the Rust Belt, and certainly like even rural areas of Canada. You were the first in your family to go to college?
Yeah.
Can you kind of describe, like, because for me it's very different. Like my parents were the immigrants and the first ones to go to university. And obviously my father being a university professor, it was just said to us, like, when you go to university. So it wasn't even something that we thought about. It's just that we thought the natural progression, you go to elementary school, high school, then you go to university. What was that like in your family? I'm always interested in working class families that, the first generation to break through and kind of get educated? Because it's not easy coming from working class families to not be working for the family, to spend money to go to college. So what was that like in your house?
So, I was talking about this the other day. Since I can remember, I I wanted to be a teacher. There was no question. I
Mm,
wanted to be a teacher. When I was a young child, I played, school. Just it was always, and I always say that I believe it was my calling.
mm,
And so knowing that, there was always this discussion that I was going to be a teacher, not necessarily that I was going to go to college, but of course,
mm,
that's what you had to do to be a
mhm,
teacher. So, pretty much the discussions were around that, me teaching and what I could do to be a teacher. And, my high school, as rural as it was, it had a special program for juniors and seniors that I could go to one of our elementary schools for a period or two and work with different children in different
mm.
classes. That was, you know, rather than me having to, and this is a long time ago, we didn't have to do 4 years of math and 4 years of science and things like that,
Mhm.
which was glorious for me because, I could go to the elementary school and do what I loved,
Sure.
teaching children. And so for my parents, they knew that this was going to be my pathway. Really, the biggest question, Jason, was, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to afford it?
Yeah, and that's certainly changed over the years in
Yes.
terms of the affordability, which I think is such downward pressure on the middle class to get people educated, and maybe we can come back to that in just a
Absolutely.
bit. But I want to kind of get another sense of young Karen. So you realize at a young age you want to be a teacher. Do you remember what kind of first sparked your love of learning? Because you're one of the people that I've over the years is always something. You're always on the cutting edge of what's happening. You're always learning still, and I'm
Mhm.
sure in your new endeavors as well. Do you remember what that was like?
It's so funny. I think about that all the time. Like what exactly was it? Because again, not necessarily, having parents who were focused on, like college education or even professional careers. I mean, my mother was a bank teller. Um, my father worked for a local radio station and then the local newspaper.
Mm,
Um, so I think about that and think, what was it that, just drove that passion for learning? I think probably the first thing was just love of children, especially young children. I still have that great passion. Babies, young children, your K to two
mm,
learners. And so I think it was probably my passion around children. And then, children are just, they're just sponges in terms of learning as they're that age. They want to learn so many things. And so, as I had different relationships and, build a built a babysitting business when I was 11 years old. I mean, I think all my experience with children is, they love to learn. And I
mm.
think that's probably what sparked my interest.
Wonderful. Um, as you went on, and maybe in high school or even in college, what would you say that you studied that most impacted how you still kind of think and work today?
Well, I think anyone who knows me will say it probably has to do something with just English and language and communication and writing. And my family will tell you spelling because I can't miss a good spelling error. Um, but I think it's that communication piece and the different ways to communicate and the English, the part of English that was about communication. Of course, I do love to read. I love reading, but I think it really was, how do we best communicate with each other? And I mean, I'll tell you, Jason, most of the challenges that I've run into in my life, whether it's, working in schools or, things that aren't going well, generally the underlying issue is communication.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there a novel, a writer, a teacher
Mhm.
maybe that really set that interest in motion?
I mean, definitely my 11th grade English teacher was one person, and it's interesting. She's probably in her, I would say, late 70s, early 80s now, and she's president of a local school board here.
Hmm.
So she kind of kept that passion going. But she definitely was someone, and I guess I would also have to say my father. So my father was, like I said, he worked for a local newspaper. He was an avid writer, and again, not having a
Hmm.
college degree, but he loved to write. I have, both my parents are have passed away, and I have all of their, the stuff that they leave behind. My father, and then eventually my mother, mounds of poetry. My father wrote
Hmm.
a poem for every event we had, anniversaries, when I had my first child, when I,
Hmm.
graduated with my doctorate, those kinds of things. My father wrote a poem. And so I think that probably that love of writing and communication also probably came from him.
That's awesome. You must really enjoy looking back and reading
I
those.
do.
That's fantastic.
I do. And I have to say I got a little bit of that myself too. I do like writing good poems. So so get ready.
Well, again, more inheritance for your grandson,
That's right. That's right.
for him to look back on, and that's great. And I love how I can continue learning something new as I do these interviews about folks I've known for a really long time. So thank you for indulging me there and taking that bit of a tour down memory lane for you. But I want to give the audience a sense of the kind of people and their upbringings and how they found their way into education. And then the other goal that I have is really to share this broad perspective on education that I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to amass over the years. And in no small part, that's, it's kind of been led by you over the years and the work we did together at our time at Discovery, which you touched upon. Um, but you, as any person really that I've interviewed so far, you've had the experience in many different states as an
Mhm.
educator, as an administrator, as a senior executive for an edtech company. You've worked in Canada. I know you've probably done some work in South America and probably involved in some of the work that Discovery did in Egypt. So out of all, like, kind of this really varied experience, I want to ask you a very specific question. What is the most inspiring or the most inspiring things that you've seen in a classroom?
So, that's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that I find myself saying a lot, especially these days, is, you know, I know that there's a lot that we need to focus on and a lot that we need to change in education. However, there are a lot of unbelievably tremendous, powerful things that are happening in classrooms around this country. And I always say to different educators and education leaders, like we need to do a better job of putting out those positives, because there are just so many, from the way that we, different ways that we spotlight children. Again, when I was growing up, it was reading and math. You had to have good reading and math scores and things like that. We have so many opportunities now to spotlight the different talents and successes of students. The other day we had there was an event that was happening in Montana, and one of the teachers is starting year 44. I mean, just unbelievable because of just the love of teaching children and what we can do for children and the importance of it. And so I just think that there are so many things that are happening that are just great for students in so many classrooms that we need to tell those stories. And I think that's probably what I've loved about, my last decade is just hearing what those are, and whether it's, right now there's a lot of conversations about career and technical education for students because, not everybody has to have a 4-year college degree. So what are the different ways that we can educate children and the different programs that we can put in place to meet all of those needs? And I see schools doing so many unbelievable things around, topics like career and technical education. So the willingness to change, the willingness to do things differently to meet the needs of our students. I mean, I just can't say enough about what is going on in our schools across the country, across the globe.
What would you say the best classrooms look like, sound like, feel like?
I think that it's all about the students, and it's the students and their community. And it's a place where, every student is welcome. Every student has a voice. We recognize that every student learns differently. And so therefore, we have an instructional program that meets the needs of our students, whatever they are. I used to say years ago that I felt like every student should have an IEP. We all learn differently. We all need different ways. I know I was a great writer when it came to math. Yeah, I was one of those people who, and still say, I can't do math. I probably can if I, probably
sure
would have had, if I would have had instruction in ways that maybe, and again, that's not a criticism of my teachers. That's just the way it was at that time. But we've learned so much now. And I think that, having classrooms where, we have a lot of different ways to meet the needs of our students and do things differently. One of my favorite educators, believe it or not, is Robert Marzano, and his work that he does around competency-based education, rather than having grade levels. Now, with that said, Jason, it's very hard to make those kinds of big changes.
Structural changes.
Yeah, very hard. I always say that, everybody's an expert when it comes to school because everybody went to school, and then we'll say, well, this is how it was when I was in school.
And I turned out fine.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Don't change that.
Yeah.
I almost lost my job twice in my life as an educator. One was trying to change a high school schedule. I mean, people just didn't want the schedule changed. And I mean, printed placards, signs came to board meetings with, don't change the schedule. The other one was math instruction. Tried to change math instruction. And it was like, this is not how I learned math as a child. We need to go back to how I was taught math. And yet we know that, the way math was taught years ago did not meet every child's needs. So I think that classroom is all about the kids. Sorry.
No, that's a great answer. Actually, just spurred another question. Do you think that's starting to change, that there's a willingness to experiment a little more? I've heard for years, and some of the bold ideas, we've kind of known about and want to push. I've heard people push back on me saying, well, you're never going to change the bus schedule. It's all around the bus schedule. Now, I understand for the last 50 years, there's a very practical reason why the bus schedule was so powerful. But now, with technology, with ride sharing, like, you and I can probably just the two of us can sit in a room and figure that out, right? It just with what's available. So I'm wondering, do you think with newer tech, with newer ideas, with a younger generation coming, do you see any kind of more flexibility now than there was, say, even 10, 15 years ago?
I mean, I definitely think schools are trying to do things differently. You see several districts where, they've changed they're not doing the, agrarian calendar of, September to June. They've changed their calendar. They might be doing, year-round schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And, even, I was reading several articles last year around, especially districts in the Midwest who just could not get teachers. And so, they went to 4-day school weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Or in some cases had 5-day weeks, but they had teachers rotating through like 4 days. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there are different ways that schools are trying to do things differently to, meet challenges, as well as, a changing world, particularly when it comes to technology. I still think that, in many cases it's hard. I know, as a school board member, every time we talk about, a big change. So for example, the district where I live, again, very rural, we have declining enrollment. And so, for 10 years, we've been talking about, do we close a building? Every single time that conversation comes up, like my husband had been on our school board years ago. He was part of that conversation. He got voted off the school board. And so it's hard. I do understand that. But I think that the first thought every time we come up upon hey, we want to make sort of a shift here is, how will our community deal with that? How will our parents deal with that? And I think that is probably different in different places. I mean, right now, there's a lot of conversation about technology. And, I worry about that. In fact, I'm working on an article right now about kind of the concept is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I know that there are things with technology that we need to be aware of, and that we need to monitor, and we need to, all of those things, but it doesn't mean shut it down. And I think those are some of the challenges that schools are facing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. I myself have changed my view on the role of technology in the classroom. I was adamant about it being used because it's already part of the environment.
Yeah.
But I do also understand, what people like Jonathan Haidt are preaching in the, and I think
scary,
based on,
right?
Yeah. Well, based on some solid research, I think, and
Yeah.
it's just, in the end, it's just some sound, rational thinking, because the technologies have become so invasive, purposely so, right? Like they're meant to be that addictive. So that's very disruptive in the very least to a classroom environment. So I think that has to work itself out, and folks have to really look at that carefully. But I'm interested in, you mentioned like great classrooms are student led. Now, and then you also mentioned the challenges with technology. What are the qualities that you most admire in great teachers to lead these really great classrooms?
Well, I would say, as you were kind of sharing your example about, technology and kind of changing positions and things with technology, I have always been, and this is really true with the technology piece as well, I've always been like a staunch advocate on great instruction and research-based and research-driven instruction. And I think that when you talk about those qualities of teachers, it's those teachers who really want to dig in, know, understand what instruction makes a difference to kids. And it's the same with the technology. Like, look, let's talk about, where do we use technology to make a difference in the achievement and the community for our students? What should that look like? What does the recent research tell us? I think those teachers who have that strong desire and that passion about instruction, like, that makes a significant difference. Look at what we're seeing happening with literacy instruction, and the different pendulums and that have gone back and forth. But again, it's about, here's what we know, here's what the research tells us. Instructionally, what does that mean, and what does that look like, so that we make sure that every child is a reader?
So if I can paraphrase you there, essentially the number one quality in teachers is the willingness to continue to learn.
Yeah, agreed. Yes, and learn. Yes.
And we've led, and you've led way more PD than me, so I don't want to put myself in the same category as you. But we've seen this kind of, and I think we talked about this previously when we were prepping for this kind of hesitancy or distraction of teachers in PD sessions. Like, I think teachers or people going into the field have to understand that you're never, like, you should never be comfortable with what you've learned. Like, so much is changing in the 10 years we've worked together. We've seen all kinds of shifts. So anything you would add there about, like, what a teacher disposition should be in terms of continual learning and what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, and I think that things like, as we look at, PD models that are effective and that really work, like, we've seen so much positive research on coaching. And so, teachers who are willing to work with instructional coaches ongoing, keep that learning, that feedback, that, continuous, what am I doing today? Did it make a difference? How do I know? Those continuous questions that we're always asking, and keep that going. I think the coaching piece is something that, like, I never had access to. We didn't do that when I was in the classroom, but there's so many opportunities for that now. And quite honestly, there's technology components that, can bring more coaching, make coaching more accessible to teachers as well. I mean, I think that that is definitely an area where we could do a lot more. And I think teachers would welcome it. I really do. I think teachers want to be great in the classroom. They want to make a difference for their kids. My husband and I used to joke. So, I started off with elementary teaching. My husband was a high school teacher and a high school principal for about 30 years. So we used to have these great conversations and would always joke about the fact that, he taught social studies, I taught kids. That was always our big joke. But, bottom line, like, we'd always get into these different discussions, and somehow it always turned around to be like something about instruction. Well, maybe if you did this, or maybe. So I do believe that it's, it is an interest and a passion for teachers. We just need to do more to help and support that.
So when it comes to professional learning, what would you say most districts get wrong about professional learning?
Yeah, I think, and I did some of this too. I think sometimes we become very program focused. And there's some value in that, because certainly if you choose a good program, it's going to have strong instructional practice in it, which is hopefully why you chose it to begin with. So it's not totally out of the way, but I do think sometimes we get very focused on we've got to provide professional learning on the new ELA program that we're putting in, and lose sight of it really is about the instruction. So yes, do that program PD, but then keep it going, focusing on instructional practice. I wish I could say there was one program that met the needs of all students, But we all know that doesn't happen. It always comes down to assessment, instruction, intervention, and then of course, yes, using great resources, but instruction's first. So I think when we think about that PD, what's the instructional focus? How do we keep that moving? How do we ensure that we've got that ongoing support for teachers? And then the only other thing I was thinking about earlier today is I got my start in the PD world because I had a pretty forward-thinking superintendent back in the 90s, and he put a program in place where newly hired teachers to the district worked an additional 15 days for 5 years. And I then was asked to run what those 15 days were going to be. And I can't tell you how wonderful that was in so many ways for the newly hired teachers, because again, majority of the newly hired teachers were coming out of college.
I mean, look,
right.
I didn't teach a long time, but I distinctly remember that first year, and thank God my mother was an elementary school teacher in what I did. And it was like prep with her. Like she was like my you talk about coaching. I had a coach on call. I think she'd retired at the time, so thankfully she had the time to help me. But she was working every day with me to prep and to look at, I taught multiple grades, so it was quite complicated. And I just remember that feeling like, man, this is much more complicated when you've got to plan it all out for the first time.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And, in a lot of our colleges, even though they might be 4 years, like in many cases, 2 of those years are kind of your liberal arts. And so, it's really maybe 2 years that you're really digging into teaching. And then, your student teaching experience is, based on the mentor that you get. And, like I had a great one. So I was so fortunate. But then you come out and it's like, okay, good luck. You're on your own. Right. Yeah. And I just think that there's so much that we can do with newer teachers because, it's that first 5 years where they leave.
Well, this is something I'm going to dig into here on the podcast too, because whenever I find someone fresh out of teachers college, I ask them a litany of questions about their experience, and to a person, they all say they wish they had more practicum time, more time in the classroom. And that's even here in Ontario. I'm not sure if you were aware, of the last several years, they made teachers college 2 years because they had a huge glut of teachers for well past a decade. And they still don't feel like it's enough time in the classroom. So that's something that I'd love to investigate further here as to, I think that's a locus for a lot of change to happen is at the, the teachers college level. So maybe we can get back into that as well. But I did want to ask you as well that you've not only built professional learning programs or PD programs for schools and districts, but then at one point, someone asked you to do it for a big Edtech company, for a big business. How or is that different?
It's a great question. The thing that was so wonderful about building it in the Edtech space is that there was all of this input about needs and what teachers need, from different school entities across the country. So, whether we're talking to, Wake County, North Carolina, or Toronto, or Miami, and, hearing from all those different places, okay, here's what we need, getting that voice from the districts and what it is that they are looking for, and then taking the research piece But the other side of it is, being at a place like Discovery, we were able to work with some of those researchers. We were able to work with, and I know, my heart goes pitter pat with talking about Michael Fullan. We were able to work with the Michael Fullans, the Robert Marzanos, and just, really make sure that it was research based. Now, I think back to, the district, and I think we did, certainly didn't get a chance to work with Dr. Marzano in the district, but we made sure it was research-based. It met our district's needs. It's just, when you're working on that corporate basis, it's, a much greater scale.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? So, the experience was phenomenal. And like I said, it brought me to really that idea of, there's so many positive things that are going on. And, a lot of the challenges that everybody faces by and large are pretty much the same. They might be different in terms of, again, size, scale, all this, but by and large, they're pretty similar.
Well, I mean, this also speaks to you always wanting to learn. I remember you always pulling me aside and asking me after every single one. And we did like 3, 4, maybe 5 a year, maybe more than that, all in. And you would always ask me, what was it like? And I just, Karen, please, we can't sit down that long. So like some of those structures and practices we just inherit, right? And so
I forgot about that. Oh my gosh, we did every year. That's so funny. Yeah,
that's all I said. That's all. It was great. I learned a lot, but I can't do the sit and get for that long. And again, I think that's just a human element. I think we say kids can't sit or boys can't sit, right. And I mean there's probably variation there, but I just think it's one of those human elements. We're not really meant to sit down for 7 hours and be talked to and take notes for that long. So I was always just curious your perspective of like, we're professionals different than teachers and probably not that different in a lot of ways.
No. And, the events that you and I were talking about, some of it, they had some PD in it, but, they were more meetings. But quite honestly, I don't think meetings are any different, to be perfectly honest. Right. We want people to walk away with, some big learnings. We've got to have that, that interaction and what we know about learning. So definitely.
I think I just got to the core of it, that you only had control of portion of it, not of the whole thing. I bet Karen Beer-led whole thing would have been different, but that's fair.
Right. We would have been doing conga lines all day long, right? I still bring up conga line. People are like, "Oh my gosh, you're crazy about conga line." I'm like, it's just because I like people getting up and talking to each other, right? It's the best.
Yes. But the only thing that sounds worse than conga lines in meetings is like having to hug everybody. I know you and I.
Yeah, that's right. No, although, Discovery has taught me to be a hugger. So
it's not that we don't like the hug. It's just, personal space is we're kind of raised that way too. But
I'm telling you, that was a big learning for me really, like
we didn't have a choice.
We hug everybody across the country. It's just like, oh my gosh. I don't think Pennsylvanians are huggers. I don't know.
Okay. So there, with the, maybe to move into from something a little lighter to something that is definitely more fraught with at least complexity. You and I have always had, I think, this wonderful relationship where we come from quite different, let's call it spots on the political spectrum, yet we've always engaged each other in a respectful way, and most oftentimes, a humorous way. And just given where we are as a society, Canada, I mean, is a very different place in the United States in a lot of ways. But I always give perspective to my American friends and colleagues this way: is like, usually when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So the kind of things that happen in the U.S. do percolate into our culture. And one thing for sure is this the divisiveness. And what I find worse, this inability to talk about values, ideas, because they all get warped through a political, perspective and distorted perspective at that. So, can you kind of just talk about your perspective on this? Obviously, you're an elected official now. So, any just general thoughts, and we can ask a few specific questions on that.
Yeah, well, elected official, and as I've told so many people, the absolute worst experience of my life in terms of, the election and just, what I faced for school board, which just blows me away. But, we have to be able to talk about politics. And I know it's hard. I told you about, my husband and I being elementary, secondary. Well, also, my husband's 15 years older than I am. And, he was raised in a world of you don't talk politics, you don't talk religion and politics.
And so I always say what's left.
That's right. Yeah. And so, anytime we go out and I'll, start something, I see his face start to, get nervous. But I believe that, we are in a time now where, we have to be able to talk to one another, and we have to be able to disagree. Like you and I said, like we're both very different in how we, our perspectives on things and how we look at things, but we can still talk about it. We can still be friends. We can, and most importantly, like we can still work together. We can come together and have some solutions. I think when people come together who have different perspectives, I actually think that can be a really good thing as an outcome, if we're willing to work together. I know it's hard because some of our issues today, they're tough. I get it, but we've got to be able to have those conversations, and we've got to be able to disagree and move on and try to resolve our issues from different perspectives. But I'm quite worried right now, politically where we are, and what seems to be happening over these next couple of months. And unfortunately, I love technology, but I don't think social media helps.
Yeah,
I don't think
that we know for certain.
Yeah, so, I don't think social media helps.
I'll put a thesis forward, and then you can agree, disagree, or comment on it. But I think a very subtle shift, and let's use the locale of the classroom as an example. I think a very subtle shift from talking about politics to talking about values and debating values would make a world of difference. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I do. I think what happens is people get scared of that because in the model we've always had, the teacher is in charge of the classroom. And therefore, it has always been, what the teacher says goes. And listen, I see value in that in a lot of different ways, especially as, you're talking about, classroom behaviors and those kinds of things.
Also understanding basic facts about the world and the history and the universe. Like there are some things that they happened, or biological or physics, or like those are the known realities, let's say.
Exactly. So I think that part gets sticky in terms of, the teacher has to facilitate the conversation, not necessarily share their thinking probably in the conversation. And listen, I think that could happen. Right now there's lots of conversations going on about religion. Here we go. Jason, politics and religion. Woohoo! There's a lot of conversation. Topics. Yeah, a lot of conversation going on about religion, and what we should be. And there's legislation that's passing in different states about hey, put the Bible in your curriculum, or and so those are all going to be really, really interesting in terms of what it means for the teachers. And again, I'm not commenting on necessarily whether I think that should be there or not. I mean, there's points where I can see, again, I can see kind of both sides. I mean, we've taught the Bible in secondary social studies for
Mm-hmm.
quite some time in terms of historically, how it has played in. So, I mean, some of what's being asked now is, a little bit different, but, it is a different role for the teacher. How do you facilitate? So if you're going to have those different values, how do you facilitate that conversation rather than I'm going to share my opinion? I think that's different. I don't think it's insurmountable, but I just think it's different.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, the obvious answer, and this probably a lot of people don't like this answer, but like the obvious answer is, yeah, you can teach the Bible. You can teach it as, a piece of literature, and you can teach it alongside other canonical piece of literature.
Exactly.
Right. And then it's like the person can still have their religious belief. They can still, but we understand it and probably better understand it in comparison to other historic works. So, I mean, I don't think the solutions that are complicated, just a lot of people with agendas want to push these things for very specific reasons, right? And all more so to the teacher to be able to discuss these things and not bring a bias to the conversation, which is, let's be frank, very difficult. But as long as the class is having debates and the students are thinking, to me, that's the ultimate goal. I mean, I had a world religions class. Most people here in Ontario had a world religions class. And a lot of people, it was their favorite class because the first time I was exposed to Islam. I didn't know anything about it. And then I had students in my class that were educating me on their religion and their history. And for me, I was always fascinated by, okay, well, what are the universal things here in, from the Bible to the Quran and to other works, right? So any other suggestions you would give to folks as to how to productively talk about politics, as citizens, and even more importantly, just as educators?
Well, this might be, shocking, but everything on the internet is not true. And so
that's our starting point, right? It should be everyone's starting point.
That's right. I think that, and I learned this during the election, be informed, be informed and, be informed in terms of, what you read from this news agency is going to be different from what you read in this news agency. And here's why. And it's, read them both, but, just know what's coming from each group, but, be informed and, make your opinion based on, the information that you have. And I think, like when we talk about technology and education, I mean, we've got to teach kids critical literacy skills. I mean, we've got to teach, and there's no better way to do that than through the internet, because, that's where so many people are getting their information. And we've got to learn better to be informed and what that looks like. And, listen, it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy. But it is, it is important. I had somebody, during my election who I've known for a long time. Our kids grew up together. And he said to me, why would I vote for you when you've been in the system, in the education system for close to 40 years and you haven't changed the system? And I said, what do you mean? And he pointed our polls, our voting polls are at our schools. And he pointed to the school and he said, this system's broken. And when I asked him what he meant by that, he shared a couple of things, none of which were true. None of which were true. And it was hard to tell him, and he didn't listen to me about the fact that the things weren't true, but they weren't. And yet, that's how he's making his decisions. So I think, as much as we can do to be informed, to help inform, and to teach our students about being informed and what that looks like. I think that's, I think that's part and parcel for having some of these discussions.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It echoes the wisdom, I believe, is Mark Twain, who said, "It's not the things that you don't know that kill you; it's the things that you know that ain't so." And
That's right.
I think that's another piece that you're alluding to. I'd like just to put a fine point on that. It's have some humility. Like, consider you could be wrong. Like, this thing that you're
Wrong.
very
That's right.
passionate about, you might be wrong. Always keep that seed of doubt there, right?
Yeah.
Let's end this kind of segment by saying I saw in the Buck County Herald that you were supported by both Democrats and Republicans in your bid. So I think that just speaks volumes to who you are as a person and your perspectives. And I wanted to talk about this to give people hope that, you can have very different perspectives. Like, I used to joke with you that, Bernie Sanders would kind of be a left-leaning liberal in Canada. He was, this kind of fear-mongering that was there in the States. So, we always shared these perspectives and learned from each other. And I think it's a good model for other folks. And it just starts with, I think, the willingness to have the discussions in a civil manner.
Absolutely. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, for school board, you can run on both tickets. So I was actually on both the Republican and the Democratic ticket. And quite honestly, was originally, even though I've been a lifetime Republican, I was asked by the Democratic Party to run because generally in this area, it's Republicans who win. And, they said to me, we know you're a moderate Republican. But quite honestly, Jason, that's what killed me. And even though I won in the election, that's what the horror was my own party, who just absolutely kept calling me a rhino.
Well, and I think these things change over time, right? And I think once they, like, for Pete's sake, listen to an interview like this that we're doing, they'll get a sense of who you are. I'm sure the work that you're going to do is going to speak for itself. And I think that's how incrementally over time, over different counties, over different states, that's how you move the needle, right? You do the good work, and it's difficult not to get sucked up into all the craziness and the drama that is, let's call it what it is, internet led, right? I don't think it's real in a lot of situations. But Karen, I did want to move on to a couple other things.
Sure.
One is I want to kind of have a bit of a synopsis of your background as a teacher, administrator, Edtech executive, and now school board member. With these years and now retiring from the Edtech side, you've seen many cycles upon cycles of, education practice, technology in and out of the classroom. You've seen how businesses have to operate in the education space. Have your views of education over time changed at all?
When I ran for school board, one of the things that I shared about why I was running was certainly, again, my love of children, my love of teaching, but it was also that I believe that public education is the backbone of our country. There have been a lot of discussions about school choice. And that is going to change public education significantly. Originally, I was like, no way that school choice is going to create a have and have not situation for children. My needle has moved a little bit. I still can't say that let's do this. But I have moved a little bit in terms of the fact that I do think that having different choices for students and their parents could really benefit their education. I just don't want it to be a competitive situation. And that's the direction we're going, and that's what makes me worried. But I look at something like I always just love the work of Alberto Carvalho, who
Mm-hmm.
was, superintendent in Miami for 12 years,
Mm-hmm.
and now he's in Los Angeles Unified. He took the system in Miami and made all kinds of choice opportunities for students. I mean, I remember one school we worked at was at a zoo. I mean, can you imagine going to school every day at a zoo? Like how unbelievable that would be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he created all kinds of choice opportunities. And I think like if that's something that school choice could do, I think that could have some great benefits. So my pendulum has moved a little bit on that, and so that helps me think a little bit differently about education in general. But I still go back to my perspectives on instruction, my perspectives on teachers being just so awesome. None of that's changed. None of
Yeah, I
that's.
mean,
I think it's probably like how we do school, maybe.
yeah, the maybe some of the practices like you mentioned there with
Yeah.
Superintendent Carvalho, which I think is a great idea. Choice and it's not even like I wouldn't even be, like choice to me seems to be that loaded language with privatization, and I hate that
Yeah.
idea of it. As a democracy, you need a robust public education system. The democracy is not going to work. But what I would say is variety, right? And variety within the public system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, and the Canadian system is set up much more robustly to support a varied public system, which I think Americans can certainly learn from, but certainly different systems overall. So I would say now, I would ask, if you look forward, say, this is hard to do, but let's say 50 years out. That's the number I like to use because it's far enough where we don't really have a good sense, and you can and use your imagination. But 50 years out, what does the education system look like? And you can, if you want to do it on the positive side or in the negative side or whatever you really think it's going to look like.
I do think that there's going to be more options for students. I think we're coming to the realization of, does school have to be 5 days a week? Does school have to be, we've already had some movement, like I said earlier, about, it doesn't have to be September to June. I think we're going to see different options. I think we might also see different, I guess I'll say maybe like structure. So for example, I think it's 14 of our states maybe who have now brought pre-K, into the system.
And Canada has
And
a nationwide program.
yeah. And conversely, back to my days of high school, I mean, do all students need 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 4 years of social studies? Or, if we do things like, as different states have done, different high school types of exams, and I'll use Pennsylvania for an example. A couple years ago, they were doing these different high school exams that many students would have taken by the end of 10th grade.
Mm-hmm.
So that could open up 11th and 12th grade to looking different. Maybe there are internships that kids do. Let's get kids out into the world. I think we're going to see more of those kinds of programs. In my work at Discovery, there's been a lot of conversations with different corporations, and they're saying things like, we need workers. How do we get students at least knowledgeable about what is available to them? If we brought those kinds of experiences into 11th and 12th grade, got kids out in the world.
And even
I
great
think all of that's
opportunities for middle
happening.
class. Yeah, great opportunities for
Yeah,
middle class students to get great summer jobs or jobs while they're in school. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. I
So I think we're going to see changes in structure in structures of what school actually looks like.
well, I am pretty hopeful, like you are, in that regard. What advice would you give superintendents, given all that you know and given that vision of what the potential is for the future of education? What advice would you give superintendents?
I think I see this happening a lot, but I think I'll say continue. You know, talk and work with each other. So it's very interesting in our
Mm,
state of Pennsylvania. One of the things I learned, again, spending 30 years in a career here, is we didn't network a lot. And I'm trying to
mhm,
figure that out as to
mm,
why that was. And, then I go to Discovery and I go to conferences like, Council of Great City Schools and now, some conferences like Education Commission of the States and things like that. And,
mhm,
and I'm seeing all these people networking with each other and they learn so much from each other. And there's, like I said, I think in the beginning, there are so many good things that are happening. Learn from each other, listen
mm.
to each other, ask each other, and do everything that you can to just, collaborate and network because there's so many good things happening. And so there's a lot of people who do that. I look at, like the Todd Wertz of the world, Todd, who used to be, CAO of Wake County and then
Mhm.
superintendent, I think it was in Orange County in North Carolina. And, he works at Discovery now, but just, he was an amazing networker. Jeff McCoy in Greenville. I mean, just amazing networkers. And then they take these ideas back to their districts and, just phenomenal stuff. So keep talking, keep collaborating, and keep sharing because it benefits so many children when you do that.
I think that's awesome advice, and I agree they don't do that enough. Although it's been changing over our time, and a lot of the work we did was to help facilitate those kind of interactions. Okay, Karen, penultimate question: um, if you had a magic wand and you can do anything you want, this is one of my favorite questions. And you can do anything. You can do multiple things. You are the queen of education, and you're all powerful. What would you do?
Um, I would make sure that every child was a reader in their early years because I just think that is the door opener to everything. I'd make sure they had a ton of great books. I'd make sure that I'd use that wand to make sure that they had the best literacy teacher in the world. I'd make sure that their parents had tons of books at home to read to their children. And I just want everybody to end up being a reader.
Wonderful.
That's my life wish.
Wonderful. And I couldn't agree more. And always our last question: what book, podcast, video, music album would you recommend for the listeners?
So, like I said, I'm an old lady, Jason. So one of the one of the I think it was Netflix, I think a small series that I just watched was when I was growing up, the We Are the World song.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I just love it because I love to sing. And of course, I think I'm a great singer. My family will tell you different. But We Are the World was phenomenal. Well, there's a Netflix series on the creation of We Are the World, which
I saw it. It's
so many.
amazing.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
so good. Oh my gosh, so good. And plus, just I love seeing some of the singers now that that you don't sing, Lionel Richie, and just I mean, amazing. Amazing.
I agree. And who knew Lionel Richie was so involved in putting that whole thing together? Like, I always loved Lionel Richie, but now even more. And then that list of characters.
And Michael Jackson bringing his snake to the studio, and just like, I'd be like, oh my gosh. And the whole Waylon Jennings thing, and Stevie Wonder. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was so good. Because when there's a lot of people involved, there's always controversy that you don't know. So
it's amazing that they got it done. It's actually a miracle that they got all those folks. That's
so good. So good.
Well, Karen, thank you very much for your time.
Jason, this was awesome. And not once did you ask me about being a Karen. How about that?
I think you of all people can rescue all the Karens.
Not sure. Well, thanks again. This was fun.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.